Imagine walking through a quiet forest at dusk. The air is cool, the light fading into soft indigo, and the only sounds are your footsteps on damp earth and the distant call of an owl. All around you, the ground is littered with ordinary stones, smooth, gray, unremarkable. You barely notice them. But then, half buried in moss near an old oak root, something catches your eye, a single crystal, glinting faintly in the last rays of sun. Your breath slows. Your pulse quickens, not because you need it, not because it serves any practical purpose, but simply because it is rare. In that moment, the ordinary world recedes, and all your attention narrows to this one elusive object. Why? What is it about scarcity that stirs something so primal within us? This is the scarcity illusion, the quiet, invisible force that makes us crave what is hard to get, not because of its intrinsic worth, but because of its vanishing presence. It's not a flaw in our reasoning, it's a feature of our evolution. Long before shopping carts and online sales, our ancestors lived in environments where resources were genuinely limited. Water, food, shelter, these were not guaranteed. Those who paid attention to what was scarce, who acted quickly when something rare appeared, were more likely to survive. Over millennia, this survival instinct became hardwired into our psychology. Today, that same wiring fires not just for food or safety, but for concert tickets, designer handbags, and even digital badges on social media. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the objects have. Consider a now famous experiment in consumer psychology. Researchers set up two identical displays of gourmet jam in a supermarket. One sign read, "Plenty in stock." The other, "Only 6 jars left." Shoppers were twice as likely to purchase from the second display, not because the jam tasted better, not because it was on sale, but simply because it seemed scarce. The illusion was enough. This isn't about rational evaluation, it's about emotional urgency. Scarcity bypasses the slow, deliberate parts of our brain and speaks directly to the ancient, watchful part that whispers, "If you don't act now, you'll lose it forever." But here lies the paradox, and the quiet unease that follows it. In our modern world, scarcity is rarely real. It is manufactured, curated, even theatrical. Limited edition sneakers are produced in the thousands. Last chance emails arrive weekly. Exclusive memberships open new tiers every quarter. These aren't natural constraints, they are carefully engineered triggers, designed to activate that same survival reflex. And we respond, often without realizing we've been nudged. We tell ourselves we're making a choice, expressing individuality, seizing an opportunity. Yet beneath the surface, we're dancing to a rhythm set long ago, in a world far removed from algorithms and marketing teams. This raises a deeper, more unsettling question. If our desires are so easily shaped by the illusion of loss, how much of our sense of self is truly our own? When we covet something because it's rare, are we expressing authentic preference, or simply reacting to a psychological lever pulled by someone else? And what happens in a world of abundance, where nothing is truly scarce? Paradoxically, abundance can dull desire. Without limits, without the tension of potential loss, even the most beautiful things can feel weightless, forgettable. It's as if our minds need the shadow of absence to give presence its meaning. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of something you've deeply wanted, not because you needed it, but because it felt just out of reach. Was it the object itself that captivated you, or the idea that someone else might claim it first? That subtle shift, from wanting to fearing loss, is where persuasion begins. Scarcity doesn't sell products, it sells urgency. It doesn't highlight value, it creates it through absence. This hunger for the rare is just the beginning. Once desire is sparked, the mind seeks to anchor it, to give it weight, context, a place in our internal landscape. And how does that happen? Not through careful analysis, not through comparison or reflection, but through the very first number we hear, the initial impression that silently sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once a value is suggested, even arbitrarily, it lingers like an echo in the chambers of our judgment, shaping decisions we believe are entirely our own. Picture this: you're standing in a softly lit auction hall, the air thick with anticipation. An antique clock, brass gears gleaming, hands frozen in time, is brought to the block. The auctioneer's voice cuts through the hush, starting at $1,000. Instantly, your mind adjusts. You consider $700 a bargain, even though moments before, you had no idea what the clock was worth. But now, that initial number, $1,000, has taken root in your thoughts, like a seed planted in fertile soil. It shapes your sense of fairness, your willingness to bid, even your perception of the object's beauty. Now imagine the auctioneer had instead said, starting at $200. Suddenly, $700 feels excessive, perhaps even foolish. The clock hasn't changed. Only the first number spoken has. And yet, your entire judgment has shifted. This is anchoring, the silent, invisible tether that binds our decisions to an arbitrary starting point, often without our awareness. Anchoring is one of the most pervasive and powerful cognitive biases in human psychology. It occurs when the first piece of information we encounter about a subject, especially a numerical value, disproportionately influences all subsequent judgments, even when that initial figure is completely irrelevant or randomly generated. In a now classic experiment, psychologists asked participants to spin a wheel of fortune labeled with numbers from 0 to 100. After it landed on a random digit, say, 65, they were asked whether the percentage of African nations in the United Nations was higher or lower than that number, and then to estimate the actual percentage. Those who spun a high number gave significantly higher estimates than those who spun a low one, even though the wheel had nothing to do with geography, politics, or global institutions. The anchor, however meaningless, had already set the stage. This effect appears everywhere, in salary negotiations, where the first offer defines the range of acceptable counteroffers, in real estate, where listing prices shape buyers' perceptions of market value, even in everyday haggling at a flea market, where the vendor's opening bid silently calibrates your sense of what's fair. What makes anchoring so insidious, and so fascinating, is how thoroughly it operates beneath the surface of conscious thought. We like to believe we are rational agents, carefully weighing evidence and arriving at independent conclusions. But anchoring reveals a different truth. Our judgments are often less like calculations and more like echoes. The first number we hear doesn't just inform us, it colonizes our mental landscape. Even when we're warned about anchoring, even when we know the anchor is random, it still exerts its pull. This isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a feature of how the mind works. Faced with uncertainty, we latch onto whatever reference point is available, using it as a scaffold to build our decisions. The problem is, that scaffold may have been placed there by someone with an agenda, by a marketer, a negotiator, or an algorithm designed to steer us toward a particular outcome. This leads to a quietly unsettling implication. If our sense of value can be so easily bent by a single, arbitrary number, how much of what we call opinion is truly our own? Consider the price tags you see online, $9.99 instead of $1,000. Not because it's cheaper, but because it feels like it. Or the original price crossed out next to a sale price, creating an anchor that makes the discount seem generous, even if the original was inflated. These aren't neutral presentations of information, they are carefully crafted nudges, exploiting the mind's reliance on initial cues. In a world saturated with numbers, prices, ratings, follower counts, performance metrics, we are constantly being anchored, often without realizing it. And because we don't notice the influence, we mistake the shaped response for authentic choice. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent purchase you made, or a decision you felt confident about. Was your judgment truly independent, or had an anchor already been dropped into the waters of your mind, rippling outward to shape your perception before you even knew it? The more you look, the more you'll find these invisible tethers everywhere, quietly guiding what we believe, what we pay, and even what we think we deserve. And once that anchor is set, we rarely question it, especially when everyone else seems to agree. Because nothing reassures the uncertain mind like the comfort of the crowd, like the quiet validation that comes from seeing others follow the same path. When an anchor is echoed by many, it ceases to feel arbitrary, it begins to feel like truth. And so we drift, not toward reason, but toward consensus, drawn by the invisible gravity of shared belief. You're in a foreign city, wandering down a narrow street as evening settles in. The air smells of spices and warm bread. On your left, a small bistro sits nearly empty, soft lights, clean tables, a waiter idly polishing glasses. On your right, another restaurant pulses with energy, laughter spills onto the sidewalk, a line curls around the corner, and every table is full. You haven't read a review. You don't know the chef. You haven't even glanced at the menu. Yet, without a conscious thought, you step toward the crowded one. Why? Because in that moment, you trusted the crowd more than your own uncertainty. You outsourced your decision to strangers whose only credential was that they were already there. This is the herd effect, the quiet, almost gravitational pull of collective behavior that shapes our choices long before reason has a chance to speak. The herd effect, also known as social proof, is a deeply ingrained psychological tendency. When we're unsure what to do, we look to others for guidance, assuming that if many people are doing something, it must be the right, or at least the safe, thing to do. This isn't mere laziness, it's an evolutionary survival mechanism. In ancestral environments, hesitation could be fatal. If the group suddenly bolted through the savannah, you didn't pause to ask why, you ran. That instinct saved lives. Today, the tiger may be metaphorical, but the reflex remains. We see it in the 5-star reviews that sway our purchases, in the viral challenges that sweep through social media, in the way stock prices soar or crash not on fundamentals, but on waves of collective sentiment. Even something as mundane as towel reuse in hotels reveals its power. Researchers found that guests were 26% more likely to hang up their towels when told the majority of guests do, not because they suddenly cared more about the environment, but because they wanted to align with the invisible norm. What makes the herd effect so potent, and so unsettling, is how effortlessly it bypasses critical thought. We don't feel manipulated, we feel reassured. Conformity doesn't register as surrender, it feels like wisdom. And yet, the crowd we follow is often an illusion. Restaurants hire actors to fill seats on opening night. Brands buy thousands of fake followers. Websites display counters that tick upward regardless of real activity, over 10,000 people viewing this offer right now. None of it is real, yet the psychological trigger fires just the same. Our brains respond not to truth, but to the appearance of consensus. This blurs the boundary between autonomy and suggestion until it nearly vanishes. Are we truly choosing, or are we simply echoing the choices of others, real or imagined, filtered through algorithms and carefully staged scenes? This raises a quiet existential question. If so much of our behavior is shaped by the perceived actions of others, where does the self end and the crowd begin? In a digital age, the herd is no longer just the people around us, it's a global, algorithmically amplified chorus of likes, shares, and trending topics, all whispering what to wear, what to believe, what to desire. We tell ourselves we're individuals, but our decisions ripple outward from the same invisible currents. Even dissent can be herd-like, rebellion becomes a trend, nonconformity a uniform. The mind craves belonging so deeply that it will conform even to the idea of nonconformity if enough others are doing it. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you chose a book, a restaurant, or even a political stance because it seemed widely accepted or endorsed? Did you weigh the evidence, or did you simply feel safer following the flow? There's comfort in the crowd, yes, but also a subtle erosion of agency. The herd effect doesn't shout, it murmurs. It doesn't command, it suggests. And in that gentle nudge lies its power. But what if you could turn this dynamic inward? Not by leading the herd, not by shouting louder than the crowd, but by planting a quieter seed, one that grows not from imitation, but from obligation. What if you could make someone feel they owe you something, not through demand, but through a small, unexpected gift? A debt, quietly incurred, waiting to be repaid. A stranger approaches you on a quiet street, holds out a single white flower, and places it gently in your hand before walking away. You didn't ask for it. You don't even like flowers. Yet, as you stand there holding it, a strange unease settles in your chest. You glance after them, half expecting a request, a pitch, a plea. When none comes, the discomfort lingers. Why? Because deep within your psyche, older than language, older than currency, older even than written law, a silent rule pulses like a heartbeat. If someone gives, you must give back. This is reciprocity, the invisible thread that has bound human societies together for millennia, the unspoken contract that turns strangers into partners, and kindness into obligation. Reciprocity is not merely politeness, it is a foundational principle of human interaction. Across cultures and centuries, the expectation of return has governed everything from tribal gift exchanges to modern diplomacy. Psychologically, it operates as a powerful motivator. When someone does something for us, however small, we feel an almost instinctive pressure to repay the gesture. This is why marketers have long mastered its subtleties. A free sample at the grocery store isn't just generosity, it's an invitation to balance the scales. A handwritten note from a salesperson, a complimentary upgrade, even a sincere compliment, each plants a seed of indebtedness. In one revealing study, waiters who offered diners a single mint with their bill saw tips increase by 3%. But when they offered 2 mints, still a negligible cost, the tip surged by 20%. The gift itself was trivial, almost meaningless. Yet the psychological weight of the gesture was profound. The diners didn't tip more because they liked mints, they tipped more because they felt, however faintly, that they owed something in return. What makes reciprocity so potent, and so ethically ambiguous, is that it masquerades as freedom while quietly enforcing compliance. On the surface, the act of returning a favor feels voluntary, even noble. But beneath that veneer lies a subtle coercion, a quiet discomfort with imbalance. Human beings are deeply averse to asymmetry in social exchange. When we receive without giving, we feel uneasy, as if we've violated an ancient covenant. This discomfort is so strong that we will often go out of our way, even against our better judgment, to restore equilibrium. And because the obligation is self-imposed, we rarely recognize it as manipulation. Instead, we credit our own generosity, unaware that our hand was gently guided by the initial gift. This leads to a haunting paradox. If every act of kindness can be weaponized to create obligation, can any gift ever be truly selfless? The moment a gift is given with even the faintest hope of return, whether conscious or not, it ceases to be pure generosity and becomes a transaction in disguise. And in a world where reciprocity is so deeply wired into our social fabric, true altruism may be not only rare but nearly impossible to verify, even to ourselves. Are we kind because we care, or because we've internalized the expectation that kindness will be repaid, directly or indirectly, in reputation, favor, or future goodwill? The line between compassion and calculation blurs until it disappears. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of the last time someone gave you something unexpected, a small favor, a thoughtful message, a token of appreciation. Did you feel warmth, or a quiet pressure to respond in kind? There's beauty in reciprocity. It fosters connection, trust, and community. But there's also vulnerability. Because once that debt is felt, however gently, the door is open. Not to demand, but to ask. And the first request is never large. It's so small, it barely registers. A tiny yes, offered without thought, that quietly unlocks the path to a much larger one. Imagine a mountain climber standing at the base of a towering peak, shrouded in mist. They don't leap to the summit in a single bound. That would be impossible, even absurd. Instead, they take one step. Then another. Each movement is small, almost insignificant on its own, yet together they carve a path upward through rock and wind. Persuasion works in much the same way. It rarely succeeds through grand declarations or forceful demands. Instead, it begins with the smallest of openings, a signature on a petition, a moment spent filling out a survey, a minor favor granted without much thought. These tiny yes seem harmless, even forgettable. But in that quiet moment of agreement, something profound happens. You've not only consented to a request, you've begun to reshape your own identity. You start to think, perhaps unconsciously, I'm the kind of person who helps, or I care about this cause, or I'm open to new ideas. And once that self-image takes root, larger requests no longer feel like impositions, they feel like consistency. This is the essence of the foot-in-the-door technique, one of the most reliable principles in the psychology of influence. By first securing agreement to a small, easy request, you dramatically increase the likelihood that a person will later comply with a much larger, more significant one. The mechanism isn't coercion, it's self-perception. In a now classic experiment, researchers approached homeowners with a modest request. Would they be willing to place a small, unobtrusive "Drive safely" sign in their window? Most agreed. Weeks later, a different representative asked if they'd install a large, unsightly billboard in their front yard that read "Drive carefully." Astonishingly, those who had agreed to the small sign were over 400% more likely to accept the massive, eyesore of a request than those who'd never been approached before. Why? Because having said yes once, they had already begun to see themselves as the kind of people who supported safe driving. To refuse the second request would create a dissonance between their actions and their emerging identity, and the mind, ever seeking coherence, chooses to align behavior with belief. What makes this process so quietly powerful is that it feels entirely voluntary. At no point does the person feel pressured or manipulated. Each yes is given freely, in good faith. Yet, unbeknownst to them, they are being gently guided along a path carefully laid out in advance. This is the mind-bending paradox of gradual agreement. Autonomy and influence are not opposites, but partners. We believe we are making independent choices, while in truth, our decisions are being shaped by a sequence of tiny commitments that accumulate into something far greater than their parts. This blurs the line between ethical persuasion and subtle manipulation. Is it wrong to understand how people construct their identities and use that knowledge to guide them toward a desired outcome? Or is it simply a recognition of human nature, no different than a teacher encouraging a student with small successes to build confidence for bigger challenges? And this leads to an even deeper question: if our sense of self is built not from grand declarations but from 1,000 minor choices, how stable is that self really? Are we the authors of our identity, or are we constantly being rewritten by the small yes and no's we utter each day, often without reflection? The idea that who we are might be less fixed and more fluid, more responsive to context and sequence than we'd like to admit, is both liberating and unsettling. It suggests that change is possible, yes, but also that we are more malleable than we imagine. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you agreed to something small, a newsletter sign-up, a charity donation, a quick favor, and later found yourself drawn into something much larger. Did it feel like a natural progression, or were you, perhaps, walking a path someone else had quietly prepared for you? But what if you could shortcut this entire process? Not by guiding someone through a series of actions, but by illuminating a single, radiant trait, so compelling that it casts a glow over everything else they see in you? A halo, not earned through steps, but bestowed in a single glance. Think of someone you admire, perhaps a brilliant scientist whose lectures captivate you, a musician whose voice stirs something deep, or a leader whose presence commands quiet respect. Now, without realizing it, you likely assume they are also kind, trustworthy, or even skilled in areas completely unrelated to their fame. The physicist must be a good parent. The actor must be wise in real life. The entrepreneur must have impeccable taste. This is not logic. It is the halo effect, the mind's quiet habit of letting one glowing trait spill its light across an entire person, softening their edges, brightening their shadows, and obscuring flaws that would be glaring in someone less luminous. The halo effect is a cognitive bias so seamless, so automatic, that we rarely notice it operating, yet it shapes our judgments in profound ways. First identified by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the 1920s when he observed that military officers rated physically attractive subordinates as more intelligent, loyal, and capable across the board, the effect has since been confirmed in countless domains. Attractive job candidates are not only hired more often but are also assumed to be more competent, even when their qualifications are identical to less attractive peers. A sleekly designed smartphone is rated as faster and more reliable, even if its performance is objectively worse than a clunkier model. In courtrooms, studies show that defendants who appear trustworthy, often based on nothing more than facial structure or grooming, receive lighter sentences than those who look untrustworthy, regardless of evidence. One virtue, one aesthetic advantage, becomes a lens through which everything else is viewed, distorting reality into a more harmonious, coherent whole. What makes the halo effect so insidious is not that it's false, but that it feels true. The mind craves consistency. It resists contradiction. Faced with a person who excels in one area, it's easier, and more comforting, to believe they excel in others than to hold the messy truth that brilliance and kindness, beauty and integrity, charisma and honesty, often exist independently. So we smooth the rough edges. We fill in the blanks with favorable assumptions. This isn't malice, it's mental efficiency. But in doing so, we surrender accuracy for elegance. We trade nuance for narrative. This reveals a quiet fragility in human judgment. If our perceptions can be so easily swayed by a smile, a tone of voice, or the curve of a logo, how much of what we call opinion is actually just aesthetic resonance? And if persuasion can be achieved not through argument, but through appearance, through the careful cultivation of a single radiant trait, then how much of influence is really about substance, and how much is theater? Consider the world of branding. Companies invest billions not to improve products, but to craft halos, through celebrity endorsements, minimalist design, or emotionally charged advertising. The product itself becomes secondary to the aura surrounding it. We don't buy the phone, we buy the idea of who we become when we hold it. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you trusted someone's advice, supported a product, or believed a claim, not because of evidence, but because the source seemed impressive in some unrelated way. Did you question their expertise in that specific area, or did the halo do the work for you? Yet beneath logic and looks lies something even deeper, something wordless, primal, and far more immediate. Before the mind constructs halos or weighs virtues, the heart has already leaned in a direction. Emotion moves through us like a current, shaping choices long before reason has time to speak. And it is this silent, subterranean pull, the quiet hum of feeling beneath the theater of traits, that often holds the true reins of persuasion. You're standing in a store, faced with two laptops. On paper, they're identical, same processor, same memory, same price. But one is displayed beside an image of a smiling family gathered around a screen, bathed in golden light. The other sits next to a dense block of technical specifications, clock speeds, cache sizes, port configurations. Which do you choose? If you're like most people, you'll lean toward the first, not because it's better, but because it feels better. In that moment, your decision wasn't forged in the cool chambers of logic, but in the warm, murky depths of your gut. And this is the quiet truth that underlies nearly every choice we make. Emotion doesn't just influence decisions, it is the decision. Reason arrives later, tidy and composed, to explain what the heart has already chosen. Neuroscience has long confirmed what poets have always known: we feel before we think. The limbic system, the ancient, emotional core of the brain, processes stimuli milliseconds before the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, even begins to engage. This means that by the time we believe we're weighing pros and cons, our course has already been set by a cascade of subtle emotional cues. Marketers, politicians, and storytellers have mastered this truth. They know that a minor key melody can evoke nostalgia so powerfully it sells a car. That warm colors, soft blues, earthy browns, gentle golds, trigger feelings of trust and safety, making a bank logo feel more reliable. That a slow, steady pace and a voiceover can lull the mind into calm acceptance, while sharp cuts and urgent tones spike anxiety and drive action. Even in politics, studies show voters often choose candidates not based on policy positions, which they may barely understand, but on how those candidates make them feel: hopeful, strong, authentic, or reassuring. The message matters less than the mood it creates. What's unsettling about this is not that we're emotional beings, that's human nature, but that we so rarely admit it. Instead, we construct elaborate justifications after the fact. We tell ourselves we chose the family laptop because it seemed more user-friendly, or that we support a policy because it's fiscally responsible, when in truth, we were swayed by a tone of voice, a photograph, or a fleeting sense of comfort. This post hoc rationalization is so seamless that we mistake it for genuine deliberation. We become storytellers of our own lives, weaving narratives of logic around choices that were, at their core, emotional impulses. This flips the entire idea of persuasion on its head. It's not about presenting better arguments or more data. It's about crafting the right feeling, because once the emotion is in place, the mind will eagerly supply the reasons. This raises a profound question: if emotion leads and reason follows, is rationality merely the hired narrator of a journey already completed? Are we not thinkers who feel, but feelers who think, constantly dressing instinct in the robes of logic to make it socially acceptable, even to ourselves? In a world saturated with information, facts alone rarely change minds. But a story that stirs longing, a symbol that evokes belonging, a voice that radiates calm, these can move mountains. Persuasion, then, becomes less about convincing and more about resonating. It's not about winning an argument, it's about tuning into the emotional frequency of another human being and speaking in a tone that feels like home. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent decision you felt proud of, perhaps a purchase, a vote, a personal commitment. Now ask yourself honestly, did you choose it because of the facts, or because it made you feel a certain way? And how quickly did your mind rush in to justify that feeling with reasons that sounded wise, even if they weren't the true cause? And those stories we tell ourselves, the ones that dress feeling in the clothes of reason, they don't emerge from nowhere. They begin with the very words used to describe the world around us. Because reality isn't just observed, it's framed. And the frame, more than the picture, determines what we see. Would you agree to undergo a medical procedure described as having a 90% survival rate? Most people would, perhaps even with quiet confidence. But what if the very same procedure were described as carrying a 10% mortality rate? Suddenly, the air feels heavier. Your palms might dampen. The risk looms larger, sharper, more personal. The numbers haven't changed. The outcome is identical. Only the words have shifted, and yet, your entire perception of the choice has been rewritten. This is the power of framing, the subtle, often invisible art of shaping reality not by altering facts, but by wrapping them in language that guides how they are felt, interpreted, and ultimately acted upon. Framing works because the human mind does not process information in a vacuum. We are not neutral calculators weighing raw data, we are meaning makers, constantly interpreting the world through emotional and cognitive filters. And one of our deepest biases is loss aversion. We fear loss far more intensely than we value equivalent gain. A 95% fat-free yogurt sounds virtuous, clean, even aspirational. Say instead that it contains 5% fat, and the same product suddenly feels indulgent, perhaps even unhealthy. Neither statement is false. Both are mathematically equivalent. Yet one invites trust, the other suspicion. This principle echoes far beyond grocery aisles. In politics, tax relief frames taxation as a burden to be lifted, not a civic duty. In war, collateral damage sanitizes civilian deaths, while peacekeeping forces casts military intervention as benevolent stewardship rather than occupation. The frame doesn't lie, but it selects, emphasizes, and colors. It doesn't change the painting, it changes the light in which we view it. What makes framing so quietly profound, and so ethically complex, is that it reveals a fundamental truth: there is no such thing as a neutral description. Every sentence, every headline, every label carries perspective. Even the most objective-seeming report chooses which details to foreground and which to omit, which verbs to use. Protesters clashed versus police attacked, which nouns to emphasize, freedom fighters versus insurgents. Language is never a clear window onto reality, it is always a lens, subtly distorting, magnifying, or softening what lies beyond. This means that truth, as we experience it, is always mediated, filtered through the choices of those who name the world for us. If reality is accessed only through the veil of language, then can we ever touch the thing itself? Or are we forever living inside someone else's wording, interpreting life through frames we didn't choose, often without even noticing they're there? This is not merely an academic concern. It shapes elections, public health, consumer behavior, and personal relationships. A doctor who says, "This treatment gives you a strong chance to recover," elicits hope. One who says, "There's still a real chance this won't work," evokes dread, despite describing the same prognosis. In negotiations, describing an offer as mostly favorable opens doors, calling it partially flawed slams them shut. The frame becomes the reality because it dictates the emotional terrain on which decisions are made. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent news story, a product you bought, or even a conversation that shifted your mind. Was it the facts that moved you, or the way they were framed? Did you notice the wrapping, or did you absorb the message as if it were raw truth? And the most powerful frame of all may not be the one that presents a choice most favorably, but the one that erases the sense of being framed altogether. The ultimate persuasion occurs not when someone accepts your wording, but when they believe the idea originated in their own mind. It is the illusion of self-discovery, the quiet magic of letting others feel they are leading, while you gently shape the path beneath their feet. In a dimly lit room, two players sit across a chessboard. The master, calm and unreadable, invites the opponent to make the first move. The opponent, emboldened by this gesture of deference, chooses confidently, believing they are setting the terms of the game. But with each response, the master guides the board toward a conclusion already envisioned. The opponent never feels manipulated, on the contrary, they feel in command, even clever. Only later, when checkmate arrives with quiet inevitability, might they wonder, was I ever truly leading? This is the essence of the Control Mirage, the art of persuasion that doesn't impose, but invites, that doesn't dictate, but designs the space in which choice appears to bloom freely. It is the illusion of autonomy, carefully cultivated, and it is perhaps the most potent tool in the persuader's repertoire. Human beings possess a deep, almost primal aversion to being told what to do. From childhood onward, we resist commands, bristle at ultimatums, and recoil from overt control. Yet, paradoxically, we lean into decisions we believe we've authored ourselves. The Control Mirage exploits this tension by offering the appearance of agency while subtly shaping the landscape of possibility. It appears in the gentle phrasing of a question: would you prefer the blue model or the silver one? When both serve the same purpose. It lives in collaborative language: let's figure out the best path forward, which implies partnership even as the direction has been pre-mapped. It thrives in leading inquiries: don't you think this solution feels fair? A question that wraps a conclusion in the guise of dialogue. In each case, the other person feels heard, respected, even empowered. They hold the reins, or so it seems. But the track beneath their feet has been laid with care, and every turn leads toward the same destination. What makes this technique so ethically ambiguous is that it feels benevolent, even respectful. Unlike coercion or deception, it honors the other person's sense of self. And in many contexts, therapy, teaching, leadership, it can be deeply constructive, helping others discover insights they might not have reached alone. But the line between guidance and manipulation is thinner than it appears. When the illusion of choice is used not to empower, but to obscure intent, it becomes a form of psychological sleight of hand. The person walks away feeling they chose freely, never realizing the menu only ever offered dishes you wanted them to eat. This raises a haunting philosophical question: if our sense of autonomy can be so easily curated, does true freedom of choice even exist? Or is autonomy itself, at least in social contexts, always a kind of shared fiction, a dance in which both parties agree to pretend the steps are spontaneous? We crave agency so deeply that we will accept even the shadow of it as real. And because the Control Mirage operates without resistance, indeed, with enthusiastic consent, it leaves no trace of its influence. The persuaded never feel persuaded. They feel wise. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you felt you'd made a fully independent decision, about a job, a relationship, a purchase, only to realize later how many of the options had been gently shaped by someone else's design. Did that realization unsettle you, or did it simply reveal the quiet architecture of human interaction? But sometimes, even the most artful mirage isn't enough. When uncertainty lingers, when the mind circles without committing, another force cuts through the fog with brutal efficiency. It doesn't coax or collaborate. It compresses. It tightens. It reminds us that time is slipping away, and with it, the luxury of deliberation. When hesitation persists, the pressure of the ticking clock becomes the ultimate persuader. The clock ticks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, like a whisper growing in your chest. The screen glows with a message: offer expires in 10 minutes. Your fingers hover over the mouse. Your breath quickens. You click buy. Only later, in the quiet aftermath, does the question surface: did you actually want it, or did you simply fear watching it disappear? This is the raw mechanics of urgency pressure. It doesn't kindle desire from nothing, but seizes the flicker of interest and fans it into a flame with the wind of panic. Urgency doesn't persuade through reason, it bypasses reason entirely, replacing deliberation with instinct, and choice with reflex. At the neurological level, urgency is a master key to the brain's fear circuitry. When time is perceived as scarce, the amygdala, the ancient alarm system wired for survival, activates with startling speed. In that moment, blood flows away from the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for logic, planning, and long-term consequences, and toward the parts of the brain that prepare us to act now or lose forever. This is the same system that once helped our ancestors flee predators or grab the last piece of fruit before arrival. Today, it's triggered not by tigers, but by countdown timers, flashing banners, and phrases like "only 3 left in stock" or "sale ends tonight." Marketers and negotiators have long known that when time shrinks, resistance softens. In controlled experiments, people consistently pay more for identical items when told they're available for a limited window. They make faster decisions, overlook flaws, and experience heightened emotional arousal, all while believing they're acting of their own free will. The irony is that the urgency itself is often entirely fabricated. The last chance email reappears next week. The limited stock is quietly restocked by morning. The deadline? Extended with a shrug. Yet the psychological grip remains just as strong, because the brain responds not to objective reality, but to perceived threat. This reveals a disquieting truth about human judgment: we are far more vulnerable to manufactured pressure than we care to admit. In calm, we weigh options. In crisis, even a simulated one, we grasp. And modern persuasion has become an art of crisis engineering, turning everyday decisions into high-stakes moments where hesitation feels like loss. The genius of urgency lies in its invisibility as a tactic. Unlike a hard sell or direct command, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like responsibility, like you're the one who must act quickly to avoid regret. But in truth, the pressure was never yours. It was placed upon you, carefully calibrated to exploit your deepest aversion, the fear of missing out, of being left behind, of watching opportunities slip through your fingers while you stood still. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent purchase, commitment, or agreement you made under time pressure. Would you have made the same choice if the clock hadn't been ticking? Or did the urgency itself become the deciding factor, transforming a maybe into a yes, not through merit, but through motion? But what if you never mention time at all? What if you never invoke scarcity or deadlines, yet still guide someone toward your preferred option with quiet precision? The answer lies not in pressure, but in comparison, specifically, in the strategic placement of a third choice, one so clearly inferior that it makes another option shine by contrast. This is the decoy move, persuasion not through speed, but through clever arrangement, where the real target wins not on its own merits, but by standing next to a carefully crafted shadow. You're scrolling through a subscription page, trying to decide. 3 options appear. Basic, $5 per month, limited features, no support. Premium, $15, full access, priority service. Deluxe, $15, full access, priority service, plus 1 obscure add-on you don't need. At first glance, Premium and Deluxe cost the same, so Deluxe seems like the obvious upgrade. But then a subtle shift occurs in your mind. Premium now looks incomplete, almost foolish, for offering less at the same price. You choose Deluxe, not because you wanted the extra feature, but because it feels like the smarter, more complete choice. Yet here's the quiet twist: the Deluxe plan was never meant to sell. It exists only to make Premium look inferior. It is a decoy, a carefully placed shadow designed to make another option glow by comparison. The decoy doesn't win the race, it simply ensures someone else does. This is the decoy effect, also known as asymmetric dominance, and it reveals a fundamental truth about human decision-making: we rarely evaluate choices in isolation. Instead, we rely on context, comparison, and contrast to determine value. Our brains are not calibrated scales weighing absolute worth, they are relational engines, constantly asking, better than what? Marketers and designers have long exploited this tendency. At a restaurant, a $30 entree might seem extravagant until it sits beside a $45 chef's tasting option. Suddenly, the $30 dish appears modest, even prudent. Print magazines often list a print-only subscription at the same price as print plus digital, making the latter seem like an irresistible bonus, even though the print-only version is rarely chosen. Its sole purpose is to anchor the perception that digital access is free, when in reality, the price was inflated to begin with. The decoy isn't a real alternative, it's a psychological lever, positioned to tilt the playing field without ever stepping onto it. What makes this tactic so quietly powerful is that it feels entirely rational. You believe you're making a savvy choice, getting more for the same price, but in truth, your preference was constructed, not discovered. The decoy doesn't lie, it simply arranges reality so that one path appears brighter than the others. And because the manipulation happens at the level of comparison rather than content, it leaves no trace of coercion. You walk away satisfied, convinced of your own discernment, never realizing that the menu was designed not to inform you, but to guide you. This raises a profound implication. If our choices are shaped not by intrinsic value but by the architecture of available options, then preference is less a revelation of desire and more a product of design. In a world where every interface, every menu, every offer is curated by someone with an agenda, autonomy becomes a mirage painted with clever contrasts. We think we're choosing what we want, but often, we're just selecting the option that looks best next to its deliberately weakened sibling. Even in politics, policy proposals are sometimes introduced not because they're viable, but to make a more moderate alternative seem reasonable by comparison. The decoy thrives wherever decisions are framed, and in modern life, nearly everything is framed. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent decision where one option suddenly seemed superior, not because it changed, but because a new, slightly worse alternative appeared beside it. Did you recognize the nudge, or did the comparison feel natural, even obvious? And yet, the influence doesn't begin when the options appear. Long before you see the choices, long before the decoy is placed on the board, your mind has already been prepared. Subtle cues, a word, an image, a scent, have been planted like seeds in the soil of your subconscious, waiting to sprout at just the right moment. This is priming, the invisible prelude to every decision, where thoughts are shaped before they even feel like your own. Earlier today, perhaps without even noticing, you heard the word yellow. It might have been in a song, a passing conversation, or a roadside sign. Hours later, someone asks you to name a fruit, and without hesitation, you say banana, not apple, not orange, not grape. You assume it's a random thought, a spontaneous association. But it wasn't random at all. Your mind had already been gently nudged, its pathways warmed by an invisible cue long before the question arose. This is priming, the silent, subterranean process by which prior exposure to a stimulus, be it a word, an image, a sound, or even a scent, shapes your thoughts, feelings, and choices later on, often without a trace of conscious awareness. Priming operates beneath the surface of cognition, activating networks of association in the brain that linger like echoes. In one now famous experiment, researchers asked participants to unscramble sentences containing words like old, wrinkle, Florida, and bingo. Afterward, as they walked down the hall to leave, they moved significantly slower than a control group, simply because their mental concept of elderliness had been activated, and their bodies unconsciously mirrored it. They didn't feel old, they weren't thinking about age. Yet their behavior shifted to align with the idea that had been quietly planted. Other studies show that people exposed to words related to rudeness are more likely to interrupt. Those primed with cleanliness are harsher moral judges. Those who smell citrus-scented cleaners spend more time tidying up afterward. The trigger is fleeting, almost forgettable, but its effect ripples outward, coloring perception, biasing judgment, and steering action. What makes priming so unsettling is that it dismantles the illusion of mental spontaneity. We like to believe our thoughts emerge from within, a pure expression of self, but priming reveals how porous the boundary between inner and outer truly is. A billboard glimpsed in traffic, a jingle half heard on the radio, the font on a website, the temperature of a room, all can tilt the needle of decision long before we realize a choice is even being made. Advertisers know this well. They don't just sell products, they seed environments with cues that make those products feel inevitable later. A luxury brand surrounds itself with images of marble, silence, and slow motion, not to describe a handbag, but to prime the feeling of exclusivity that will bloom when you see it in a store days later. Politicians choose backdrops, lighting, and even clothing colors to prime trust, strength, or compassion before uttering a single policy point. This leads to a quiet existential tremor. If your choice was shaped hours or even days ago by stimuli you barely registered, where does influence end and self begin? Are you the author of your thoughts, or are you more like a garden, tended by unseen hands, where seeds are planted in the dark and only later mistaken for native growth? The implications stretch beyond marketing into the very core of identity. If our preferences, moods, and behaviors can be swayed by forgotten whispers, then autonomy becomes less a fortress and more a landscape, constantly reshaped by winds we cannot see. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent opinion you held strongly, a sudden craving, or an unexplained shift in mood. Could it have been primed by something you encountered earlier, a phrase in a book, a color in a dream, a stranger's tone of voice? The answer may never be certain, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes priming so potent. It works best when it remains invisible. And sometimes, the most powerful seed is not an idea at all, but an absence. Not a word spoken, but a sentence left unfinished. Not a presence, but a gap. Because the human mind abhors a vacuum of meaning, and will rush to fill any silence with its own invention. This is the mystery effect, desire not kindled by revelation, but by concealment, the quiet magnetism of the unknown. A book sits on a shelf, its cover sealed with a small brass lock. You've never seen its title, never read a word of its contents, yet something about it pulls at you. Or perhaps it's a message that arrives incomplete. I saw what you did last, and then silence. The sentence hangs, unfinished, and your mind races to complete it. Or consider a person who speaks in riddles, reveals fragments of their past, offers glances but never full gazes. They don't overwhelm you with information, they leave spaces between their words, and it's in those spaces that your imagination takes root. Why does the unknown captivate us so much more than the known? Because the human mind is wired to seek resolution. It cannot abide an open loop. An unanswered question creates a low hum of tension, a cognitive itch that demands to be scratched. And so we chase, we lean in, we return again and again, not for what is given, but for what is withheld. This is the mystery effect, desire not born from revelation, but from concealment. The mystery effect thrives on what psychologists call curiosity gaps, those deliberate omissions that create a vacuum between what we know and what we feel we need to know. When information is partially revealed but not fully disclosed, the brain experiences a form of psychological tension, a state of unresolved arousal that compels us to seek closure. This is why television shows end episodes on cliffhangers, why movie trailers hint at plot twists without showing them, and why vague, tantalizing compliments like "you're full of surprises" linger in memory longer than direct praise. The less we know, the more our imagination fills the void, and in that act of mental creation, the object of mystery grows larger, richer, more alluring than it could ever be in plain sight. Imagination, after all, is the ultimate amplifier. It tailors the unknown to our deepest hopes, fears, and fantasies, making it far more potent than any fixed reality could be. Paradoxically, full disclosure often deflates desire. Once the locked book is opened and its pages read, once the message is completed, once the enigmatic person reveals their full story, the spell breaks. The mystery loses its charge, and with it, much of its allure. This reveals a counterintuitive truth about persuasion and human connection. Sometimes, withholding is more powerful than revealing. In marketing, brands cultivate mystique by hinting at secret ingredients or unreleased features. In storytelling, the most haunting characters are those whose motives remain partially obscured. Even in romance, a certain reserve can sustain attraction far longer than total transparency. The mystery effect doesn't manipulate through force or flattery, it seduces through absence, inviting the other person to become a co-creator of meaning. But this raises a haunting question: if longing thrives in darkness, is truth ever as compelling as the shadow it casts? The mind doesn't just seek answers, it often prefers the questions, because questions allow us to project our ideal onto the blank screen of the unknown. Reality, by contrast, is stubbornly specific, often mundane, and rarely as grand as our private fantasies. In a world saturated with information, where everything is explained, exposed, and exhaustively reviewed, mystery becomes a rare and precious currency. It offers not certainty, but possibility, and possibility, in all its shimmering ambiguity, is where desire lives. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of something you've pursued not because you knew what it was, but because you didn't. Was it the object itself that drew you, or the version your mind invented in the silence? Yet once the mind has settled on a belief, even one born from partial information, even one that's false, it will go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. It will twist facts, ignore contradictions, and reinterpret reality to preserve the story it has chosen. This is the confirmation trap, the quiet prison of our own convictions, where evidence is not evaluated, but enlisted. You believe you're a generous person. It's not just something you do, it's part of who you are. So when someone asks you to donate to a cause, you say yes, even if your bank account is stretched thin. You don't give because you've researched the organization or weighed the impact. You give because saying no would create a quiet fracture in your self-image, a dissonance too uncomfortable to bear. In that moment, your belief didn't merely describe you, it commanded you. This is the power of the confirmation trap, the invisible loop where identity shapes action, and action reinforces identity, locking us into patterns we mistake for choice. Beliefs, far from being passive reflections of who we are, actively dictate what we do, often without our conscious consent. At the heart of this mechanism lies confirmation bias, one of the mind's most tenacious habits. We don't approach the world with open neutrality, we scan it for evidence that confirms what we already believe. We remember the times we were kind and forget the moments we turned away. We interpret ambiguous events in ways that uphold our self-narrative. And when faced with contradictory information, we either dismiss it, distort it, or bury it beneath layers of justification. Skilled persuaders understand this deeply. They don't argue facts, they invoke identity. A fundraiser doesn't say, "Please give money." They say, "People like you, who care about fairness, know this matters." A leader doesn't demand loyalty, they say, "Our team is made of those who step up when it counts." Once that identity is activated, once you've been reminded of who you believe yourself to be, the corresponding action feels less like compliance and more like integrity. To refuse would be to betray yourself. But this elegant alignment between belief and behavior comes at a cost. While it can inspire noble actions, acts of courage, compassion, or principle, it can also trap us in rigid narratives that resist growth. If you see yourself as always right, you'll dismiss criticism as ignorance. If you define yourself by a political label, you'll reject data that challenges your tribe's stance. The mind, in its quest for coherence, becomes a curator of reality, admitting only what fits the story it has already written. This is the darker side of the confirmation trap. It doesn't just shape behavior, it shields us from change. Truth becomes secondary to consistency. And in a world that demands adaptation, the very mechanism that gives us stability can become a cage. Is growth possible when the mind defends its story at all costs? The answer is yes, but only if we learn to hold our identities lightly. The most resilient people aren't those with the strongest self-concepts, but those willing to let their stories evolve. Yet this requires a rare kind of humility, the willingness to be wrong, to be surprised, to allow new evidence to rewrite old chapters. Most of us, however, prefer the comfort of continuity. We'd rather twist reality than revise our self-image. And so we remain faithful to versions of ourselves that may no longer serve us, simply because they feel familiar. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you acted not because you agreed with a request, but because it aligned with how you see yourself. Did it feel like virtue, or like obligation wearing the mask of virtue? And the most seductive story of all isn't the one we tell ourselves in private, it's the one that seems to be lived by everyone around us. When our personal narrative echoes a collective one, it gains weight, legitimacy, even inevitability. This is the bandwagon effect, the quiet pull of shared belief, where conformity feels like belonging, and dissent feels like exile. You've never heard this song before. It doesn't speak to your usual taste, perhaps it's too upbeat, too simple, too polished. But it's everywhere, #1 on the charts, blaring from passing cars, featured in every influencer's reel, praised by friends who normally have impeccable taste. So you listen. And soon, you find yourself humming it. You tell others you like it. But do you? Or has the sheer weight of its popularity reshaped your perception until liking it feels inevitable? This is the bandwagon bias at work, the quiet, almost gravitational pull of collective behavior that makes popularity feel like proof. If everyone is doing it, believing it, or buying it, then it must be right, or good, or true. The crowd becomes the compass, and we follow its needle without questioning where it points. Bandwagon bias is more than mere trend following, it is a deep-seated psychological reflex rooted in our need for social belonging. From the earliest days of human tribes, aligning with the group was not just socially advantageous, it was often a matter of survival. To stand apart was to risk ostracism, vulnerability, even danger. Today, that same instinct manifests in subtler ways. We adopt fashion trends because everyone's wearing them, invest in stocks surging in online forums, or endorse ideas simply because they're widely shared. We use popularity as a mental shortcut, a heuristic, for quality, assuming that if something has been embraced by many, it must have merit. Marketers amplify this instinct relentlessly. Bestseller labels on books, follower counts on social profiles, trending now banners on streaming platforms, all are engineered not to inform, but to trigger imitation. The message is implicit, others have already decided. You can trust their judgment. Yet here lies the profound irony, popularity is often not the result of merit, but of momentum. A song climbs the charts not because it's inherently better than others, but because early listeners, perhaps swayed by a celebrity endorsement or algorithmic promotion, gave it initial traction. That visibility attracted more listeners, whose engagement signaled further popularity, creating a self-reinforcing loop. In controlled experiments, researchers have shown that when people are told a song is popular, they rate it as higher quality, even if it's objectively identical to an unpopular version. The bandwagon doesn't just reflect taste, it creates it. This transforms culture into a hall of mirrors, where influence masquerades as value, and consensus replaces critical discernment. In a digital age governed by algorithms that prioritize engagement over truth or artistry, the loudest voice isn't necessarily the wisest, it's simply the one the system chose to amplify first. This raises a disquieting question. In a world where trends cascade through networks at lightning speed, are we truly choosing our preferences, or are we merely echoing what the machine has already decided we should like? Our autonomy becomes entangled with the collective, and individual taste dissolves into the hum of the hive. Even dissent can become a trend, co-opted and commodified until rebellion itself is just another product on the shelf. The bandwagon rolls on, and whether we climb aboard willingly or are swept up in its wake, we rarely notice the moment we stop steering. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a belief, habit, or preference you hold that aligns closely with what's currently popular. Did you arrive at it through personal experience and reflection, or did the crowd's approval make it feel safe, even obvious? But sometimes, that guiding voice doesn't need the roar of the masses behind it. Sometimes, it needs only one quality: certainty. Because authority doesn't shout to be heard, it simply states, and the mind, craving clarity in a noisy world, leans in. In the absence of consensus, we turn not to the many, but to the one who seems to know. A man in a lab coat stands beside you in a quiet room. Wires snake across the floor, connected to a control panel with a row of switches labeled with increasing voltages. Through a wall, you hear muffled protests, then screams, as you're instructed to administer what you believe are painful electric shocks to another person. You hesitate. Your conscience flares. But the man in the coat speaks calmly, firmly, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you go on." And so, against your better judgment, you press the next switch. You do it not out of malice, not out of indifference, but because he sounded sure. This is the authority effect in its most haunting form, the human tendency to obey those who project certainty, even when that obedience conflicts with our deepest moral instincts. The authority effect is not about tyranny, it's about efficiency. In a complex world, we cannot verify every claim, assess every expert, or question every instruction. So we rely on signals, titles, uniforms, jargon, posture, that suggests someone knows what they're doing. A doctor's white coat, a judge's robe, a professor's credentials, these are cognitive shortcuts that allow society to function. But as Stanley Milgram's infamous experiments revealed in the 1960s, this deference can be dangerously automatic. In his study, 65% of ordinary participants continued administering what they believed were potentially lethal shocks simply because an experimenter in a lab coat told them to. They sweated, trembled, even protested, but they obeyed. Not because they wanted to harm, but because the voice of authority offered a script, and stepping off it felt like stepping into chaos. What mattered wasn't the man's actual expertise, it was his aura of certainty. Titles, tone, even the setting, a prestigious university, were enough to override empathy, ethics, and reason. What makes this effect so unsettling in our current age is how easily authority can be performed rather than earned. Social media influencers adopt the cadence of experts, citing studies without sources. AI chatbots deliver falsehoods with unwavering confidence. Podcast hosts declare opinions as facts, wrapped in the velvet cloak of calm conviction. The trappings of authority, deep voices, measured pacing, technical language, are now tools anyone can mimic. And because our brains respond to the signal, not the substance, we often comply before we question. Certainty, not correctness, becomes the currency of influence. This creates a paradox: the more confidently something is stated, the more believable it seems, even if it's entirely wrong. Meanwhile, those who speak with nuance, caution, or humility are often dismissed as weak or uninformed. In a culture that equates decisiveness with competence, doubt becomes a liability, and hesitation a flaw. This reveals a chilling vulnerability at the heart of human judgment. We are willing to outsource not just decisions, but morality itself, to those who appear confident. We tell ourselves we're being reasonable, following guidance, but in truth, we're seeking relief from the burden of choice. And in doing so, we grant immense power to whoever wears the costume of authority most convincingly. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you accepted advice, followed instructions, or changed your mind because someone spoke with unwavering assurance. Did you later discover they were mistaken? And if so, why did their certainty outweigh your own discernment? Yet authority isn't always spoken. Sometimes, it doesn't need words at all. It lives in the tilt of a head, the steadiness of eye contact, the unhurried pace of a step. It resonates in silence, in space, in the way someone occupies a room. This is nonverbal influence, the language beneath language, where presence speaks louder than proclamation. Two people meet in a quiet room. No words pass between them, no introductions, no pleasantries. Yet within seconds, an unspoken hierarchy emerges. One stands tall, shoulders back, gaze steady, occupying space with calm assurance. The other shifts slightly, arms crossed, eyes flickering downward, voice softening before a single sentence is spoken. Without a word, dominance and submission have been established. This is the realm of nonverbal influence, the silent, ceaseless current of signals that flows beneath the surface of every human interaction. While we obsess over what to say, the truth is that over 90% of communication happens not through language, but through posture, eye contact, proximity, rhythm, and breath. Persuasion, far from being a matter of clever arguments, often unfolds in the silence between words, in the subtle choreography of presence. Nonverbal cues operate on a level deeper than conscious thought, speaking directly to the primal brain, the part of us that once assessed threats and allies on the savannah long before language evolved. A steady gaze doesn't just signal attention, it conveys honesty and confidence. An open posture, uncrossed arms, relaxed stance, radiates approachability and trust. Mirroring another's gestures, even subtly, builds rapport by triggering a sense of similarity and safety. Leaders know this instinctively. They use power poses before high-stakes meetings to project authority, not for the audience, but to recalibrate their own physiology. Negotiators control physical space, leaning into show engagement, stepping back to create pause, shaping the emotional temperature of the room without uttering a syllable. Even vocal tone, though technically auditory, functions nonverbally. A slow, low-pitched voice suggests calm control, a rapid, high-pitched one betrays anxiety. Pauses, not just words, carry weight. Silence can convey thoughtfulness, tension, or command, depending on how it's held. What makes nonverbal influence so uncanny is its dual invisibility. We read these signals without realizing we're doing so, and we emit them without intending to. Your slumped shoulders during a video call might undermine your expertise more than any factual error. Your hesitant handshake might whisper doubt louder than your confident pitch. In job interviews, courtrooms, first dates, and boardrooms, people form lasting impressions within seconds, based not on what you say, but on how you inhabit your body. This means persuasion is never truly off. Even in stillness, you are communicating. Even in solitude, your posture shapes your mood, your breath influences your thoughts, and your stance affects your sense of self. The body is not just a vessel for the mind, it is a language the mind listens to constantly. This raises a quiet but profound question: if silence can command, if stillness can persuade, then what are your body and breath saying right now? Are your crossed arms guarding your ideas from scrutiny, or shielding you from connection? Is your rapid breathing signaling urgency, or anxiety masquerading as passion? We often assume that to influence others, we must speak louder, argue better, present more data. But the most compelling presence is often the quietest, the person who listens with their whole body, who holds space without filling it, whose calm certainty radiates not from words, but from the way they occupy the world. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of someone whose mere presence disarms or inspires you. Was it their arguments that moved you, or the way they leaned forward when you spoke, the steadiness in their eyes, the unhurried rhythm of their speech? Chances are, you remember how they made you feel long after you've forgotten what they said. And yet, even the most convincing presence can falter when inner belief and outer action fall out of alignment. When what we do contradicts what we claim to value, the mind rebels, not with logic, but with discomfort. This inner friction, this psychological tension, becomes unbearable until something gives. And that is where cognitive dissonance takes hold, forcing us to change either our behavior or our beliefs to restore peace. You smoke, though you know it's unhealthy. Every time you light a cigarette, a quiet tension coils in your chest, not just physical, but psychological. You believe in self-care, in longevity, in responsibility, yet here you are, acting against those very values. This inner friction is cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that arises when our beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors clash. It's not mere guilt, it's a deep, almost visceral unease, the mind's insistence on coherence in a world that rarely offers it. And because this discomfort is so intolerable, we are driven to resolve it, not through reflection, but through action or rationalization. You might quit smoking to align your behavior with your beliefs. Or, just as likely, you might soften your stance. It's not that bad. My grandfather smoked and lived to 90. Life's too short to worry. Either way, the dissonance must be soothed. And in that urgent need for resolution lies one of the most potent tools of persuasion. Cognitive dissonance operates as a silent engine of change because it exploits our fundamental need for self-consistency. We cannot long tolerate being at war with ourselves. When a persuader highlights a contradiction, you say you value honesty, yet you stayed silent when it mattered. They don't argue, they activate. They create a psychological itch that demands scratching. Skilled influencers use this not by demanding change, but by gently illuminating the gap between who someone says they are and what they do. Environmental campaigns ask, you care about your children's future, why support policies that harm it? Ethical brands whisper, you believe in fair labor, does your current choice reflect that? The question isn't accusatory, it's reflective. But once the dissonance is felt, the mind races to close the gap. Often, the easiest path isn't to change behavior, it's to adjust belief. And that's where persuasion finds its opening. Yet this mechanism is ethically double-edged. On one hand, it can awaken conscience, inspire growth, and catalyze meaningful transformation. A person confronted with the dissonance between their values and actions may finally donate, recycle, speak up, or heal. On the other hand, it can be weaponized through shame, guilt, or manufactured moral conflict. Cult leaders, manipulative partners, and predatory marketers all use dissonance to destabilize and redirect. If you really loved me, you'd do this. True believers don't question. The line between ethical influence and emotional coercion is thin, drawn not by the presence of dissonance, but by the intent behind its creation. This reveals a deeper fragility in human belief. If the mind will twist truth, rewrite memory, or dismiss evidence just to feel whole, how stable is any conviction under pressure? Our beliefs are less like bedrock and more like sandcastles, constantly reshaped by the tides of internal comfort. We don't seek truth so much as we seek peace, and if peace requires delusion, we'll often choose delusion. This doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. But it does mean that every belief we hold is, to some degree, provisional, vulnerable to the quiet calculus of cognitive comfort. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you changed your mind not because new evidence convinced you, but because holding your old view became too uncomfortable. Was that growth, or self-deception dressed as wisdom? Once someone has invested time, money, pride, they'll keep going, even into ruin. Because stopping would mean admitting it was all for nothing. The sunk cost fallacy takes this dissonance and deepens it, turning past commitment into a prison of future action. And the longer they stay, the harder it becomes to walk away, not because the path is right, but because leaving would mean their sacrifice had no meaning. You've spent years on a project, nights sacrificed, savings drained, relationships strained. It was supposed to be your breakthrough, your legacy. But now, the signs are undeniable, it's failing. Logically, you should walk away. Cut your losses. Start anew. Yet you don't. Instead, you double down, invest more time, more money, more hope, because to stop now would mean admitting those years were wasted. The thought is unbearable. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the quiet, irrational spell that binds us to the past, making us believe that what's already lost must be redeemed by what's yet to come. It's not strategy, it's sorrow dressed as strategy. And it turns perseverance into a kind of self-imprisonment. The sunk cost fallacy thrives on our deep aversion to waste. Human beings are wired to honor investment, whether it's time, energy, emotion, or money. To abandon something we've poured ourselves into feels like erasing a part of our history, invalidating our past choices, and confronting the painful truth that we were wrong. So we keep going, not because there's hope, but because stopping would force us to grieve. This dynamic plays out everywhere, in businesses that cling to failing products long after the market has moved on, in relationships that limp forward out of loyalty to what once was, in governments that escalate wars to justify the lives already lost. The more someone is given, the tighter the grip of sunk cost becomes. It's not about the future anymore, it's about salvaging the meaning of the past. Skilled persuaders understand this vulnerability and exploit it with gentle precision. They don't ask for everything at once. They invite small commitments first. Just try it for a week. Sign this pledge, it's symbolic. Share your story, it might help others. These early investments seem trivial, even noble. But they plant a stake in the ground. Once you've given something, your name, your time, your voice, you begin to identify with the cause. To walk away would now mean not just losing resources, but betraying your own narrative. You become its defender, its evangelist, not because it's succeeding, but because you've tied your self-worth to its survival. The sunk cost is no longer just financial or temporal, it's existential. This raises a haunting question: is perseverance always virtuous? Society praises those who never give up, who see it through to the end. But what if that resolve is not courage, but captivity? What if the noblest act isn't to persist, but to release, to admit that some paths, no matter how dearly bought, lead nowhere? The sunk cost spell is so powerful because it masquerades as integrity. We tell ourselves we're being loyal, responsible, or determined. But often, we're just avoiding the shame of wasted effort. And in doing so, we waste even more. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a commitment you've held onto long past its expiration date, not because it served you, but because letting go would mean acknowledging loss. Was your persistence wisdom, or just the ghost of past decisions whispering, "Don't let it have been for nothing"? And beneath this fear of wasted effort lies an even deeper motivator, one that doesn't whisper, but roars in the silence of the mind. It's not the hope of gain that drives us forward, but the terror of loss. Because losing what we have, even the illusion of progress, feels far more painful than never having had it at all. This is the primal engine of human action. Fear of loss doesn't just influence choice, it often dictates it entirely. You're offered a choice: gain $100 with no risk, or avoid losing $100 you already have. Logically, the outcomes are identical. Yet emotionally, they feel worlds apart. The thought of losing what's yours, money, status, security, even a fleeting opportunity, triggers a sharper, more urgent response than the promise of an equivalent gain. This isn't pessimism or weakness, it's hardwired neurology. Decades of research in behavioral economics, most notably through Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's prospect theory, confirm what we feel in our bones: losses hurt about twice as much as gains please. The brain's threat detection system, the amygdala and its ancient network, fires with greater intensity and speed than its reward pathways. Evolutionarily, this made perfect sense. Missing a potential berry might mean hunger tomorrow, but failing to notice a lurking predator meant death today. So we became creatures who prioritize avoiding harm over seeking benefit. And though our threats are now more abstract, reputation, relevance, retirement savings, the same primal circuitry still runs the show. This asymmetry between loss and gain is the engine behind some of the most effective, and ethically fraught, forms of persuasion. Marketers know that "don't miss out" ignites urgency far more reliably than "get this amazing offer." Insurance companies don't sell protection, they sell the avoidance of catastrophe. Political campaigns rarely say, "vote for a better future." They warn, "if you don't act, everything you value is at risk." Even in personal relationships, the fear of losing someone often spurs more dramatic action than the joy of gaining their affection. Fear of losing status drives career choices, fear of missing a trend shapes consumption, fear of social exclusion molds beliefs. The message doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to frame the choice as a potential loss, and the mind will lean toward action, often without conscious deliberation. What makes this dynamic so potent, and so dark, is that it reveals a fundamental truth about human motivation. We are driven far more by the desire to preserve what we have than by the dream of what we might attain. Hope is gentle, fear is urgent. Inspiration invites, loss demands. And in a world saturated with choices, the quickest way to cut through noise is not to dangle a carrot, but to wave a shadow. This doesn't mean fear-based appeals are always manipulative. Sometimes, they serve genuine protective functions, like public health warnings or financial planning advice. But the line blurs quickly. When fear is manufactured, exaggerated, or detached from real risk, it becomes a tool of control rather than care. And because the emotional impact of loss is so visceral, we rarely stop to question whether the threat is real or merely rhetorical. This raises a quiet but persistent question: if we are so deeply wired to avoid pain, can hope ever truly compete with fear? Can a vision of a better world move us as powerfully as the specter of a worse one? History suggests that while fear may mobilize quickly, it rarely sustains. It exhausts. It narrows vision. It breeds anxiety, not agency. Yet in the short term, it wins, again and again, because it speaks the oldest language the brain understands: survival. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a recent decision you made out of fear, of missing out, of falling behind, of being judged. Did it feel like protection, or like pressure wearing the mask of prudence? Yet sometimes, the most disarming tool isn't fear at all, but its opposite, curiosity. Not a warning, but a wonder. Not a threat, but a puzzle. A strange, unexpected request that disrupts the usual script of resistance and opens a door where none seem to exist. In that moment of surprise, the defenses drop, not because you're afraid of losing, but because you're drawn toward the unknown. A stranger approaches you on a quiet street, holding a stuffed penguin. "Could you please hold this for a moment?" they ask, completely deadpan. You blink. You laugh. It's absurd, unexpected, whimsical, utterly out of context. But because it's so strange, so harmless, and so disarming, you say yes. You take the penguin. A few seconds later, the same person asks if you'd be willing to make a small donation to an environmental cause. And you do, even though you might have brushed off a direct request moments earlier. Why? Not because you suddenly care more about the cause, but because the odd request disrupted your mental script. In that moment of playful confusion, your automatic no reflex, the one that guards your time, your resources, your personal boundaries, simply switched off. This is the curiosity hook, the art of using the unexpected not to deceive, but to create a fleeting window of openness where persuasion can take root. The mechanism behind this is both elegant and revealing. Human beings operate on autopilot much of the time, relying on ingrained scripts to navigate social interactions. When someone asks for money, a favor, or attention, we often respond with a rehearsed refusal before even processing the request. But introduce something bizarre, an illogical, whimsical, or surreal element, and the script breaks. The mind, confronted with incongruity, pauses. It leans in, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. In that suspended moment, defenses lower. Cognitive rigidity softens. And into that gap steps the real ask. The now famous penguin study, conducted by researchers in France, demonstrated this with striking clarity. Passers-by were significantly more likely to comply with a donation request after first being asked to hold a small, absurd object, like a penguin, than those who received the request outright. The initial oddity wasn't the goal, it was the key. It didn't persuade through reason or emotion, but through disruption. What makes the curiosity hook so potent in our modern world is its contrast against the backdrop of relentless predictability. Every day, we're bombarded with polished pitches, algorithmically optimized ads, and rehearsed sales tactics, all designed to feel familiar, safe, and efficient. But familiarity breeds resistance. Weirdness, by contrast, cuts through the noise. It's memorable. It's human. It signals that the requester isn't following a script, which paradoxically makes them feel more authentic. Brands have begun to harness this. Campaigns that start with riddles, products launched with surreal teasers, customer service interactions that begin with a joke, all leverage the same principle. Absurdity becomes strategy not because it's clever, but because it bypasses the gatekeepers of skepticism. Yet this also exposes a quiet vulnerability in our psychological architecture, how fragile our boundaries truly are. We like to believe our no is firm, principled, deliberate. But the curiosity hook reveals that often, it's just habitual, a reflex, not a resolution. It takes only a moment of surprise, a penguin, a riddle, an offbeat question, to dissolve that barrier. Compliance doesn't follow from agreement, but from disorientation. And while this can be used playfully or ethically, to spark joy, invite engagement, or soften a difficult conversation, it can also be weaponized. Imagine a scammer who begins with a bizarre but harmless request to lower your guard before making a manipulative ask. The line between charm and coercion blurs in the space between laughter and compliance. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you said yes to something not because you were convinced, but because the approach caught you off guard. Did it feel like generosity, or like your autopilot had simply been reset? And once that door is open, even just a crack, something remarkable happens. Even a no can become a gateway. Because rejection, when met with grace and a slight shift in framing, can transform into reconsideration. This is the quiet alchemy of the door-in-the-face technique, where the first no isn't an end, but the beginning of a more compelling yes. You ask someone for $100. They hesitate, then say no, politely, perhaps even apologetically. You don't argue. You don't press. Instead, you pause, then offer a new request. I understand. How about just $10? Suddenly, their posture softens. They agree, quickly, even eagerly, and walk away feeling not pressured, but generous. They might even thank you for being reasonable. What just happened? This is the door-in-the-face technique, a subtle but powerful form of influence that transforms rejection into compliance by making a smaller request appear magnanimous in comparison to an initial, inflated ask. The first no isn't a dead end. It's the necessary prelude to a more palatable yes. Unlike the foot-in-the-door strategy, which builds agreement through small, escalating commitments, door-in-the-face works in reverse. It begins with a request so large, so clearly unreasonable, that refusal is almost guaranteed. But that refusal isn't the goal, it's the setup. When the second, much smaller request follows, it feels like a concession, a compromise, even a favor. Psychologically, this triggers two powerful forces. First, there's the desire to restore self-image. After saying no to a seemingly altruistic, if excessive, request, people feel a twinge of guilt or social discomfort. Agreeing to the smaller ask allows them to reaffirm their identity as kind, cooperative, or fair-minded. Second, there's a sense of reciprocity. The requester lowered their demand, so the respondent feels obliged to meet them halfway. In one classic study, researchers found that people were far more likely to agree to chaperone a group of juvenile delinquents on a zoo trip if they had first been asked, and refused, to commit to a much larger, 2-hour-per-week counseling role for 2 years. The second request seemed trivial by comparison, and compliance soared. What makes this technique so effective is that it feels collaborative, not coercive. The person doesn't sense manipulation. They feel they've exercised agency, made a balanced choice, and even done something virtuous. The persuader appears flexible and understanding, which builds trust rather than resistance. And because the shift from $100 to $10 happens in conversation, the contrast feels natural, not staged. Yet the entire sequence is carefully engineered. The initial request isn't a genuine ask, it's a rhetorical device, a psychological lever designed to recalibrate perception. The real target was always the smaller amount, the larger one existed only to make it shine. This raises an ethical tension that lingers in the quiet space between cleverness and deception. Is door in the face a respectful acknowledgement of human psychology, or a form of emotional bait-and-switch? On one hand, it doesn't lie. It doesn't threaten or deceive. It simply uses contrast to frame a request in the most favorable light. In negotiations, diplomacy, or even parenting, such framing can facilitate cooperation without conflict. On the other hand, it exploits guilt and social pressure, emotions that cloud true consent. When someone says yes not because they want to, but because they feel bad for saying no, is that generosity, or obligation in disguise? The technique works precisely because it bypasses rational evaluation and appeals to the desire to feel good about oneself. And while that may lead to positive outcomes, donations to charity, volunteer sign-ups, conflict resolution, it does so by nudging people through emotional currents they didn't choose to navigate. Take a moment to reflect on this. Think of a time you agreed to something after initially refusing a larger version of it. Did you feel you were being reasonable, or were you quietly compensating for the discomfort of your first no? All these techniques, from scarcity to reversal, from priming to the halo effect, share a quiet philosophy that human behavior is less a product of conscious will and more a response to invisible currents, framing, timing, contrast, emotion. And in this delicate ecosystem of influence, the smallest nudge, applied with precision and patience, can redirect not just a decision, but a life. In a school cafeteria, apples and cookies are both available. No rules are imposed. No foods are banned. But when the apples are placed at eye level, on a well-lit shelf just as students enter, and the cookies are tucked slightly lower into the side, something remarkable happens. More students choose fruit, without being told to, without even realizing they've been influenced. This is nudge psychology in its purest form, the gentle art of redesigning the environment so that the better choice becomes the easier one, not through force or restriction, but through subtle shifts in attention, order, and design. The freedom to choose remains intact, but the architecture of that choice has been quietly reshaped. Nudge theory, popularized by behavioral economists Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, rests on a simple but profound insight: people don't make decisions in a vacuum. We are creatures of habit, cognitive shortcuts, and limited attention. Given too many options or too little guidance, we default to the path of least resistance, the option that's most visible, most convenient, or already selected for us. Nudges work by aligning that path with desired outcomes. An opt-out system for organ donation, where citizens are automatically enrolled unless they choose otherwise, dramatically increases donor rates compared to opt-in systems, simply because inertia favors the status quo. Similarly, when employers set automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans, participation soars, not because people suddenly care more about their future, but because doing nothing now leads to saving, not spending. Even the order of items on a ballot or a restaurant menu influences selections. What appears first tends to be chosen more often, not due to merit, but mere prominence. What makes nudging so compelling is its elegance. It doesn't eliminate freedom, it preserves it. No one is forced to eat the apple or save for retirement. The cookie and the opt-out button remain available. Yet by understanding how people actually behave, rather than how we imagine they should, nudges guide without commanding, influence without imposing. In public health, energy conservation, finance, and education, this approach has led to significant improvements in well-being without triggering the backlash that often accompanies mandates or bans. It's persuasion that feels like benevolence, a quiet hand on the tiller, steering the ship while letting the crew believe they're still at the helm. But this very subtlety is also what makes nudge psychology ethically complex. If choices are always framed, always arranged, always presented through someone's lens of what is better, then who gets to decide what better means? A government might nudge citizens toward vaccination for public health, but could just as easily nudge them toward compliance with surveillance under the guise of security. A corporation might nudge users toward privacy settings that favor data collection, calling it personalization. The line between welfare and manipulation blurs when the nudger's values are hidden behind the neutral language of choice architecture. And if every environment, from apps to supermarkets to voting booths, is designed to guide us in a particular direction, then is freedom merely the illusion of unguided choice? Are we ever truly choosing, or are we always responding to invisible currents shaped by those who control the layout of our options? This leads to a quiet but essential question: can we design nudges that are transparent, democratic, and reversible, ones that empower rather than steer? Some argue that the best nudges are those we'd endorse if we understood them: saving more for retirement, eating more vegetables, reducing carbon footprints. But even then, the act of choosing which behaviors to encourage is itself a value judgment. Nudging may be the gentlest form of influence, but it is still influence, and with it comes responsibility. Take a moment to reflect on this. Look around your daily life, the apps you use, the forms you fill, the stores you shop in. How many of your choices have been gently shaped by someone else's design? And if you knew, would you mind, or would you welcome the guidance? As you drift towards sleep, consider this: persuasion need not be loud, forceful, or deceptive. At its best, it is a quiet understanding of human nature, used not to control, but to help us become who we say we want to be. And perhaps, in mastering these invisible currents, we don't just learn to influence others, but to see ourselves more clearly in the mirror of our own choices. So as you drift towards sleep, let this settle gently in your mind. Persuasion has never been about force, coercion, or clever tricks alone. At its core, it is an act of profound attentiveness, an intimate study of the quiet currents that shape human behavior when reason sleeps and instinct stirs. These currents are not flaws to be exploited, but features of a mind constantly navigating uncertainty, seeking connection, and striving for coherence in a world of contradictions. The fears that make us act, the desires that pull us forward, the illusions that give meaning to scarcity, mystery, or authority, these are not just levers for influence, but mirrors reflecting our deepest human needs: to belong, to matter, to feel in control, even when we're not. In learning how these forces operate, in recognizing how a single word can anchor a decision, how a pause can convey power, how a no can blossom into a yes, we do more than acquire tools of persuasion. We gain a clearer lens through which to see ourselves. Every time we notice the halo around a stranger, feel the tug of a manufactured deadline, or catch ourselves justifying a choice we didn't fully understand, we glimpse the architecture of our own minds. And in that awareness lies not manipulation, but freedom, the quiet freedom to choose more deliberately, to resist when needed, and to align our actions with our truest values, not just the most convenient narrative. So let these ideas linger not as tactics to wield, but as invitations to wonder. For in the space between influence and autonomy, between illusion and insight, we discover something tender and true, that to understand how we're moved is, ultimately, to become more fully human. And perhaps, in that understanding, we find not just the art of persuasion, but the grace of self-awareness.